Prime Minister Andrew Holness, before your name became a headline, before your title became a shield, you were a son of the Caribbean. And sons of the Caribbean carry a weight that the world does not see, a weight carved from slavery, separation, and centuries of polite suffering. My brother, I do not come to accuse you. I come to remind you, because our people, scattered across oceans, carry the same inheritance of wounds. Africa bleeds loudly, the Caribbean bleeds quietly. Yet pain, whether soft or fierce, still cries out for justice. And to my elders listening today, you who marched, you who prayed, you who buried dreams in systems not designed for us, you know this truth better than anyone. History does not wait for fearful men. It demands courage. It demands clarity. And today, it demands a choice. We stand at a crossroads, not as nations apart, but as one people divided by water yet united by blood. The question is no longer what happened to us. The question is, what will we finally do about it? If you believe our people deserve more than survival, stay with us, stay awake with us, and subscribe to this community of truth. When we begin to speak about the Caribbean and Africa, we must begin with truth, not the softened truth of textbooks, not the diplomatic truth of press statements, but the lived truth carved into the bones of our people. For centuries, the Caribbean and the African continent have been treated as two separate stories, but in reality, they are one divided story, one interrupted family, severed by ships and shackles, stitched back together only by memory and struggle. Prime Minister Andrew Holness stands today not merely as a Jamaican leader, but as a symbol of a region caught in a quiet storm. The Caribbean is a land where the sun is bright but the politics are dim, where songs are loud but sovereignty is whispered, where the people are proud but the governments tread carefully. The Caribbean has learned to survive, but survival is not the same as freedom. Survival is the first breath. Freedom is every breath that follows. Africa, on the other hand, is no longer whispering. Africa is roaring. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, leaders have broken ties that once seemed unbreakable. They have rejected political puppetry, refused economic strings, and begun the work of reclaiming dignity. Whether one agrees with their methods or not, the message is undeniable. The continent is choosing itself. It is rising. It is unashamed. It is unafraid. But the Caribbean, my brothers and sisters, the Caribbean is still waiting. Waiting for permission. Waiting for approval. Waiting for a moment when the West finally says, "Now you may speak." And while it waits, the world changes. Jamaica, Haiti, Trinidad, Barbados islands, rich in story, rich in soil, rich in spirit, have been kept economically dependent by forces older than their independence flags. These nations hold culture that shaped the world: reggae, calypso, resistance theology, liberation philosophy. Yet they remain politically and economically framed as small, fragile, vulnerable, as if their destiny must always sit in the hands of others. This is the soil in which Andrew Holness stands. Not a villain, not a traitor, but a man shaped by a system that rewards obedience and punishes rebellion. A system that has taught Caribbean leaders to step softly, speak gently, and avoid confrontations that might disturb their diplomatic comfort. But listen closely. This is the same system that once told African nations to be patient, be diplomatic, be grateful. And where did patience lead them? Into debt, into dependency, into repeating cycles of begging those who once enslaved them for loans, aid, and promises wrapped in fine language. Now look at Jamaica. Look at Haiti, where freedom was won with blood, only to be punished with debt for generations. Look at Trinidad, Barbados, St. Lucia, places where foreign interests still hold decisive influence over key industries, currencies, and missions of development. The Caribbean's tragedy is not a lack of intelligence, not a lack of courage, not a lack of leadership. The tragedy is silence, a silence taught, rewarded, and polished over decades. But silence has never saved a single oppressed nation. History shows us this. Nations are not freed by caution. They are freed by clarity. They are freed by the moment when a leader says, "Enough." And that is why the call directed at Andrew Holness in this message carries weight far beyond him. It is not about a man. It is about a region. It is about a crossroads where the Caribbean must decide whether to remain a polite spectator or become a full participant in the liberation of the Black world. Because Africa is moving. Africa is shifting. Africa is redrawing its future with bold lines. And if the Caribbean continues to walk softly, it will wake up one day to realize that the world moved without it, that Africa built new alliances, new currencies, new defense systems, and the Caribbean was too cautious to step forward. For the elders listening today, those who lived through the Black Power era, the Civil Rights Movement, the Garvey years of memory, you know this rhythm. You know the cost of waiting too long. You know the heartbreak of watching leaders speak beautifully but act fearfully. You know what it means when a people lose their moment. And right now, the Caribbean is on the edge of losing its moment. Because a storm is forming, a storm of global realignment, a storm of African resurgence, a storm of new alliances that will reshape the next century. The Caribbean must choose whether to step into that storm with dignity or hide from it in comfortable silence. And that brings us back to Andrew Holness, not as a target, but as a mirror. A mirror held up to every Caribbean leader who has preferred stability over sovereignty, every leader who has chosen the applause of the West over the respect of their own people, every leader who has forgotten that history has never rewarded the safe. The question is growing louder, the people are growing restless, and the world is shifting faster than small nations can afford to ignore. And so we ask, what happens to a region that remains quiet while its brother continent rises? What becomes of a people who wait for change instead of shaping it? What future awaits those who choose silence at a time that demands courage? But what happens when silence becomes the very weapon used to keep a people in chains? When a people begin to rise, the world does not clap. The world clenches, the world tightens. Because the rise of the oppressed is always the tremor that shakes the foundations of those who once ruled over them. Look to Africa, not the Africa of postcards and news clips, but the Africa standing tall today. Nations that once bent under foreign pressure have begun to straighten their backs. They have expelled foreign soldiers, rejected imposed currencies, and confronted the very powers that wrote the rules of their poverty. The response from the West has been swift, predictable, and fear-filled. Sanctions, media campaigns, diplomatic scolding, economic threats dressed as concern. For centuries, Western nations have positioned themselves as guardians of stability. But stability in their dictionary has always meant control. Control of resources, control of governments, control of the narrative. So when Mali, Niger, and Guinea refused to kneel, the world did not celebrate their courage. It panicked. Because when Black nations rise without permission, the entire system of global hierarchy trembles. And somewhere in the middle of this earthquake stands the Caribbean watching, waiting, calculating. But calculation is not conviction. Waiting is not leadership. The Caribbean is caught between two visions of the future, one where it continues to be the well-behaved region, praised for diplomacy, rewarded for docility, and another where it steps into the storm of history and claims its rightful place beside Africa. Prime Minister Andrew Holness sits at the edge of this divide. The world applauds him for his calm, his politeness, his adherence to Western expectations. But applause from the West has never meant advancement for the Black world. The same applause echoed when African leaders signed away their resources. The same applause filled the air when nations accepted IMF loans that hollowed out their futures. The same applause decorated speeches that sold dreams but secured dependency. But applause does not free nations. Applause does not erase debt. Applause does not build sovereignty. You, the elders listening today, understand this deeply. You lived through decades when the West praised progress, while Black communities at home faced poverty, drugs, incarceration, and broken promises. You learned long ago that praise from powerful nations is often a warning, not a compliment. And so the question becomes, what happens when the Caribbean refuses to make a choice? When its leaders stand at the doorway of history, but do not step through? The people have begun to speak. In Kingston, in Port-au-Prince, in Bridgetown, in the diaspora of London and New York, there is a murmur rising, a murmur of impatience. The younger generation is asking why Africa is moving and the Caribbean is not. The elders are asking how many cycles of caution must repeat before a leader finally says, no more. This rising pressure is not imaginary. It is not poetic. It is real. The world is shifting. Alliances are shifting. New blocs are forming. Africa is making its intentions clear. Independence, self-determination, self-respect. And within this rising wave is something symbolic, something powerful, what some call an Ibrahim Traore moment, when a leader stands with enough clarity, enough conviction, that his courage becomes a catalyst for millions. Not because he is perfect, but because he is unapologetically committed to his people's freedom. The Caribbean has not had such a moment in generations, and the absence is starting to show. Meanwhile, the West watches the region with eyes wide open, not with admiration, but with calculation. They know the Caribbean is the spiritual bridge between Africa and the diaspora. They know that if the Caribbean aligns with Africa, the global order will tilt. They know that unity among Black nations would be the breaking of a cycle centuries old. And so they reward caution. They celebrate moderation. They praise leaders who speak softly and act gently, because gentle leadership keeps the chains polished, but present. But beneath the surface, something is changing. The Caribbean public, like Africa before it, is starting to question the purpose of their diplomacy. What have decades of politeness achieved? They ask. What has playing by the rules delivered? They look at rising debt, stagnant wages, migration crises, failing infrastructure, and they know the answer. Diplomacy has not delivered freedom. Diplomacy has not delivered prosperity. Diplomacy has not delivered dignity. And as Africa steps boldly into the storm, the Caribbean risks being left behind not because it lacks courage, but because its leaders have convinced themselves that safety is more noble than sovereignty. But history does not reward safety. History rewards those who choose liberation over comfort, truth over applause, and courage over caution. And now we stand at the edge of the high point, the place where the Caribbean must either follow Africa's example or accept that its silence is a choice. Because the world is not waiting. Africa is not waiting. history is not waiting. And so we must ask, but if the Caribbean refuses to choose, does that mean the choice will be made for them? If a region remains silent long enough, silence becomes its identity. And identities built on silence always carry the scent of surrender. The Caribbean has survived. Yes, but survival without sovereignty produces a quiet kind of suffering. The kind that hides behind palm trees, warm seas, and tourist smiles. Walk through Kingston and you will see it. Not in the sunlight, but in the shadows, in the unemployment, in the underfunded schools, in the frustration of young people who feel their futures shrinking. Walk through Port-au-Prince, and you will see it written on every building, still scarred by crisis, still waiting for a government strong enough to resist foreign influence. Walk through the smaller islands, and you will hear it in conversations whispered in taxis, at market stalls, in the songs of musicians who use melody to speak truths politicians refuse to utter. These are not isolated problems. They are consequences of diplomacy that protects the global order, but not the Caribbean people. For decades, Caribbean nations have been caught in a cycle of dependence. Loans that come with conditions, aid that comes with instructions, partnerships that come with ownership, and every generation pays the price. Your generation, the elders, have seen this pattern repeat so many times that it feels like an old hymn sung out of habit. Borrow, depend, adjust, repeat. But a hymn sung long enough becomes a prophecy. And that prophecy is unfolding right before our eyes. The consequences of caution are no longer theoretical. They are visible, they are measurable, they are heartbreaking. When leaders choose silence to appease foreign nations, it is the people who bear the punishment. Not the ministers in their offices, not the diplomats at their banquets. It is the farmers, the teachers, the market women, the taxi drivers, the youth who leave home because home has no space for them. Economic dependency becomes emotional dependency. Political caution becomes generational stagnation. Diplomacy becomes a permanent delay of freedom. And while the Caribbean hesitates, Africa evolves. Africa is building new alliances, new currencies, new security networks. Africa is demanding respect, not requesting permission. Africa is rewriting the script that once confined its destiny. And yes, the world has taken notice. Even within Africa, when leaders speak boldly, the people respond with a surge of pride. You can hear it in what some call the Ibrahim Traore reaction, the kind of response that erupts when a leader's courage awakens something long asleep in the hearts of ordinary people. Not because one leader is the answer, but because boldness itself is contagious. Yet in the Caribbean, boldness has become rare, and the absence of boldness carries a heavy price. If the Caribbean continues to walk the path of caution, 3 consequences will deepen. 1. More poverty, more vulnerability. Dependency on loans ensures that wealth flows outward, not inward. Every payment to the IMF is a dollar taken from schools, hospitals, infrastructure, and the dreams of children. 2. More migration, more fragmentation. Families will continue to be separated as young people flee in search of opportunities denied at home. The region loses not just individuals, but futures. 3. More isolation in the New World Order. As Africa forms blocs and alliances, as BRICS expands, as global power shifts eastward, the Caribbean risks being a quiet spectator present, but irrelevant. And this consequence is the one the elders understand most deeply. Irrelevance. A nation can survive poverty. A nation can survive crisis. But no nation can survive invisibility. And so the question is no longer academic. It is personal. It is spiritual. It is generational. What happens when a region born from resistance forgets how to resist? What happens when the grandchildren of revolutionaries grow up under leaders who fear revolution itself? What happens when the diaspora from Harlem to London to Lagos watches the Caribbean fall behind, not because it is weak, but because its leaders refuse to act? This is not simply politics. This is identity. This is destiny. And now we must turn to you, the audience, the elders who have witnessed the cycles of history with your own eyes. Do you believe the Caribbean should finally stand with Africa? Tell us in the comments your voice matters. Because the truth is this: the longer the Caribbean waits, the more severe the consequences become. Silence does not delay oppression. Silence invites it. And as the world shifts, as Africa rises, as new alliances form, because the world is shifting fast, and those who hesitate may wake up to a future already decided. When we speak of the Caribbean's choices, we cannot ignore the eyes watching from across the ocean. The United States, Europe, and the organizations tied to their influence have long viewed the Caribbean not as a region with its own destiny, but as a strategic zone to be shaped, guided, and restrained. To them, the Caribbean is not a brotherhood of nations. It is a buffer, a border, a barrier. America's concern is simple: proximity. The Caribbean is on its doorstep, a region it has historically treated as an extension of its sphere of control. Since the Cold War, Washington has believed that any independent movement in the Caribbean, political, economic, or ideological, must be monitored, managed, or neutralized. They speak of partnership and development, but the subtext is always the same. Do not drift too far. Do not align with powers we do not approve of. Do not think you can choose your own path without consequences. Europe's concern is different but deeply rooted. Europe sees Africa rising and knows its centuries-long advantage is slipping. The Caribbean, historically shaped by Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, is still entwined with European interests through banking, trade, currency systems, cultural influence, and political alignment. Europe wants stability, but not the kind that empowers black nations. It wants stability that preserves its economic access. So when Africa expels foreign forces, Europe panics. When Africa questions old financial systems, Europe tightens its grip. When African nations unite under shared defense or economic frameworks, Europe warns, pressures, and expresses concern. Not because Africa is destabilizing the world, but because Africa is destabilizing European dominance. And this is where the Caribbean becomes critical. If the Caribbean joins Africa in unity not through charity, but through shared struggle and shared vision, Europe loses strategic influence. America loses a quiet neighbor, and the entire Western narrative of small black nations needing guidance collapses. This is why Western powers praise Caribbean leaders who maintain the status quo. It is why they elevate voices that favor diplomacy over independence, caution over courage, negotiation over transformation. A predictable Caribbean is useful. A united Caribbean is dangerous. A Caribbean aligned with Africa is unthinkable. The world does not fear a single black nation. The world fears connection. Connection of culture. Connection of economics. Connection of strategy. Connection of identity. Because when black nations connect, they build what the West cannot control: a moral authority born from shared suffering and a power born from shared purpose. And so the world watches carefully, quietly, anxiously, not out of love, not out of concern, but out of fear of what might happen if the Caribbean finally steps forward and says, "We choose ourselves, we choose our people." We choose our brothers and sisters in Africa. Because at that moment, the balance of power tilts. At that moment, the illusion of Western superiority cracks. At that moment, the black world stands taller than it has in centuries, but we are not yet at that moment. The Caribbean still stands at the doorway of history, undecided, cautious, divided, and so the world waits, calculating, anticipating. The road ahead for the Caribbean is not paved in certainty. It is paved in choices that echo far beyond the islands, far beyond this generation, far beyond the borders drawn by colonial hands. The future will not be shaped by fate. It will be shaped by courage. There are 3 paths before the Caribbean. Path 1. Standing still. This is the path of comfort, the path of familiarity. The path of diplomacy that has delivered so little yet demands so much. If the Caribbean remains still, it will continue to drift in the currents of global powers who see the region not as a partner, but as a pawn. Poverty will deepen, migration will rise, dependency will harden into permanence. The islands will survive, but survival without dignity is simply a slower kind of decline. Path 2. Holding on to the West, this path feels safe because it is known. It comes with praise, invitations, summits, speeches filled with polite applause. But beneath that applause lies a truth older than the Commonwealth and more predictable than IMF policy. The West protects its interests first, and the interests of the Caribbean have never been its priority. Choosing this path means choosing stability over sovereignty. It means choosing short-term comfort over long-term freedom. It means choosing the appearance of partnership over the reality of subordination. Path 3. Standing with Africa. And then there is the path of unity, the path that requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to offend the very powers that once claimed ownership over our ancestors' names and futures. This is the path where the Caribbean steps out of the shadow of caution and walks into its rightful place beside Africa. Not as follower, not as dependent, but as brother, as builder, as partner. Imagine a future where Caribbean nations no longer negotiate from weakness, but from strength with Africa at their side. A future of shared markets, shared diplomacy, shared defense, shared pride. A future where black nations speak not in fragments, but in harmony. A future where the children of the Caribbean do not have to choose between leaving home or living without opportunities. A future where unity becomes a shield strong enough to block centuries of exploitation. This is not fantasy. This is strategy. This is not idealism. This is necessity. And for African Americans listening today, you know better than anyone that unity is not a luxury, it is survival. You watched what disunity cost us in the civil rights era. You watched what fragmentation cost us in politics, in economics, in community. You have seen how power grows when black people stand together, and how quickly it fades when we stand apart. The Caribbean must now make a choice that echoes the struggles you lived through. Will it continue to be shaped by outside forces, or will it choose to shape its own destiny? Will it cling to caution, or will it embrace courage? Will it remain a scattered archipelago, or will it become the bridge that reconnects the diaspora and the mother continent? The moment is here. The crossroads is clear. The world is shifting, and the Caribbean cannot remain a silent spectator any longer. And so the only question left is this. If this is the moment history calls us to rise, will the Caribbean finally answer? When we look across the Atlantic, when we trace the lines of history carved into our skin and our memory, we begin to understand something profound. The Black world has never been divided by nature, only by design. The separation of Africa and the Caribbean was not an accident. It was a strategy. And for centuries that strategy worked, because we allowed caution to silence our collective power. But today the veil is lifting. Africa is rising, not quietly, but with a roar that shakes the halls of global power. The Caribbean stands at the edge of a new dawn, its people restless, its youth searching, its elders remembering what unity once meant. And the diaspora from Harlem to Brixton, from Lagos to Kingston, is watching with hope, fear, and expectation. This is the hour when history bends. This is the season when old chains crack. This is the moment when a people decide who they truly are. Across continents, across generations, across languages, one truth is calling out. Black nations cannot afford silence any longer. Not when Africa is building alliances. Not when the Caribbean is questioning old loyalties. Not when the diaspora is yearning for a home that speaks with one voice. The world has witnessed what happens when leadership embraces courage. We have seen the kind of awakening some call an Ibrahim Traore moment, a moment when conviction becomes contagious, when boldness becomes a blueprint. And yes, the global response, the Ibrahim Traore reaction, shows us that the world does not fear our weakness. The world fears our unity, our clarity, our refusal to kneel. And so we must ask, with honesty and urgency, will the Caribbean rise into its own Ibrahim Traore moment? Will its leaders choose the applause of the West or the respect of their own people? Will they cling to the comfort of stability or embrace the cost of sovereignty? The future of the Black world will not be written in a boardroom or in an IMF agreement or in the quiet language of diplomacy. It will be written by people, by us, who decide that unity matters more than fear, that destiny matters more than permission. And if you believe that, if you believe our children deserve a future shaped by our hands rather than foreign interests, if you believe Africa and the Caribbean are stronger together than apart, then I invite you from the depth of your spirit to stand with this message, to stand with this movement, and to join this community. Subscribe, share your voice, and help us build the unity our ancestors dreamed of. Because the world will not free us, but we can free each other.